All right. Well, welcome, everybody. I'm going to be talking a little bit as was advertised, pricing and selling PHC services. So a little bit about my background. I'm a 30 plus year veteran of the green industry, been doing this for about 33 years. I started out as an injection technician my first summer with Rainbow, then worked as a plant healthcare technician upon graduating from college with a degree in biology. Worked as the operations manager, consulting arborists for more than a decade. And for the last 7 or 8 years, I've been the director of Arborist Development. Most companies would probably call it a sales manager. But at Rainbow, we do things a little bit different. And so we have some creative titles. Many of you maybe worked with one of our arboriologists. It's another term we kind of coined for people that educate about trees. So, well, the objectives today that we're going to run through. We're going to understand some pricing strategies and models. That's going to encompass probably the first half of the time. It may seem a little bit dry, but I think it's something that's important for people to understand. What are the different models, and start thinking about the pricing strategies that you're using right now and which ones you may be using and you don't even realize you're using that model. Learning to choose a pricing model for any type of service. We'll talk a little bit about that. Discussing what makes an effective pricing model for salespeople, at least from our experience, what works best. How to determine if a pricing model is working. And finally, how that relates to selling plant health care services. And one of the things you'll hear me emphasize and say from all the kinds of talks I do related to this is it all comes down to how well you create pricing and models around that will really determine how well you can sell plant healthcare services. There's a lot of other training and things you can do, but if that part, no matter what else you do, if that part isn't easy, your salespeople will not offer and sell those services. So what is pricing? Well, I want to get clear a little bit of difference between pricing and cost here at the beginning of the talk. Pricing is a process where a business sets a price that's going to sell its products, services, and may be part of the business's marketing plan. So it's really what we offer out there in the marketplace. Cost, on the other hand, is your direct material costs, the chemicals, the products, the cabling materials that you use, all of those kinds of things. Plus the direct labor costs, your variable costs, which is a variable cost as well. What is the cost of the people that go out and actually do that work? And then finally, you've got your overhead costs or your fixed costs. When you put all those costs together, that's really what your cost is. So obviously the goal of being in business, at least from a financial perspective, is to make a profit. You've got to set prices at levels that exceed your costs. If your costs exceed your prices, you're going to lose money. It's pretty basic stuff, but oftentimes many businesses don't even know where their break-even points are. And it's really critical that you put together structured pricing models so that you have a way to evaluate those numbers as you go through the year and look at each one of your services and whether or not you're charging enough money for it. So at the beginning here, we're going to talk about some of the models of pricing. This might seem, like I said, a little bit dry, but I think it's really critical to set a bit of a foundation. So I'm going to run through a bunch of these pretty quickly, and you'll have this as a recording to refer back to. This is not an exhaustive list. These are the ones that I've put on here because in some variation or form over time, we've used all of these at Rainbow. The many methods of pricing products in a given market, methods to set the pricing, takes into consideration a lot of different marketing factors, but basically they can be divided up into about 2 groups. The first group is cost-oriented methods, and we'll talk about those, and then market-oriented methods, where the market is driving what you're charging. So with cost-oriented methods, it's one way to provide a basis for price and it can include options, but it's not limited to cost plus pricing, markup pricing, or break-even pricing. And we'll talk about each one of these briefly, and then I'll show you what some of the math looks like, so to speak, on some of these, and then a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages for these different things as we go along. So with cost plus pricing, it involves adding just a certain percentage of the cost, whatever your cost you came up with, in order to set a price that is, somewhere between the cost and your price, and that's what your profit ends up being. So here's kind of the math on it, just to illustrate these. So again, be thinking about what you're doing with your pricing. You might not know that these are what you're doing, but that might be exactly what you're doing. So it's a cost plus a markup percentage equals your price. So if you have a $400 cost for something and you have a 10% markup, that equals a $440 price. And included in that cost, is all of the different things that we talked about, the overhead expenses, your labor, your products, all the other things that you would need. So your markup is basically what you're saying you'd like to make for profit, ultimately. And so you can vary that number. And as long as you're accurate on what your costs are, and have projected those properly, if you add these on, you'll come up with, a price that should, get you the profit that you were desiring or looking for. Now, advantages of cost plus pricing is probably one of the simplest ones out there to do. Most people, buyers, if you were talking to them about your prices or why the price is what it is, because we get that question from clients, most buyers are going to feel it's a pretty fair way of pricing stuff. Like, you've taken into account everything that it costs you to do this service for them, and you've put on a reasonable markup for, the risks that you take for the changing market conditions, and, to make a good living. You can't just price stuff always at a break even. And we'll talk about sometimes that actually is a market price that you would want to put out there. It can offer competitive stability too. It's a price point that oftentimes your competitors are going to have similar costs. The labor price for tree climbers, for instance, in your market might be about the same, or for the staff that does your plant healthcare delivery. Those are going to probably be comparable. So if you're taking into account those kinds of things, you'll end up with some market parity, which we'll talk about on some of the other models as well. Disadvantages: cost plus pricing really doesn't take into account any of the amounts with demand on what the services might be. So basically, if you think to basic economics, you hear people talk about supply and demand. Well, obviously, if there's more of something out there and less people want it, the price is probably going to be lower. But if there's a limited amount of something out there and a lot of people want it, the price is higher. If any of you have kids right now, my son is desperate to get a Sony PlayStation 5, and it retails at $499, but you can't get one in the stores because they're just not available, and the market is selling them for $900+ even $1,500 online to get one from somebody that has gotten a hold of some of them. The other thing with cost plus pricing is you've got to have a pretty good idea of how much of that service you're going to do for the year. Because if you remember, it takes into account your materials cost, your labor cost. Those two will fluctuate probably. That's why they're variable. Depending on how much you do, you're only going to have to pay for what you actually have done. But with those fixed costs, those overhead costs, if you've got rent on your building, if you go out and do 5 jobs during the year or do 1,000 jobs during the year, you've got to allocate that rent expense, for instance, or your lease cost across however many units you end up doing. So The more that you do, obviously, the better that will work out for you, but you do have to actually meet whatever you had expected to. Now, the second one is markup pricing. With markup pricing, it's a variation of cost pricing plus pricing, but in this case, the markups are calculated as a percentage of the selling price and not as a percentage of the cost price. So I'll kind of show again, what does the math look like on this? Well, let's say that you wanted to have a markup of a certain percentage. You could say your sales price minus the unit cost divided by the unit cost times 100 is going to be the markup percentage. So what the math looks like on that is, let's say you had a $260 unit cost and a 60% markup percentage, your selling price would be $416 for that service. So it takes into it comes at it in a little bit of a different way. One of the variations on markup pricing that we use and have over time is having the product cost reflect a percentage of your selling price. So what you'd do is you'd look at what your product cost was, and you would divide that product cost into the selling price. So for example, if you had a $20 product cost and you wanted your product to be only 20% of the selling price, it would put you at a percentage, where the $100 would be the selling price for the service. And years ago, I remember I did some seminar early in my career, and I got stuck in my head, that 15, 20% is a reasonable number to be in for your product cost with a lot of plant healthcare services. Since then, I've realized that it depends on what the product is. Some things are really cheap, and others are a lot more expensive than that, and might be 35 or even 40% of your cost. And it will depend sometimes on market pressures in your area. But in this way, it's a fairly easy way to look at, what your cost of materials are, and then putting a price on that allows that to be a percentage of it. Now, what this doesn't take into account, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the disadvantages here in just a minute on that one, is that it doesn't, sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. It doesn't take into account necessarily you making a profit. So you've got to do some good analysis to make sure over time that whatever percentage you're setting for that product cost is going to get a price that will allow you to make a profit once all the expenses have been done. Because this one's focusing only on the product cost, not on your true costs, which would be the products and the labor and your overhead costs. But it is a fairly simple one to put into action that can help you when you just don't know where to start with something. It's a great one to do from a modeling standpoint. Break-even pricing is much like it's described. It's a set to, where you look at all of your costs that you're going to have and you set a price where they're about the same, and you're not going to make a profit, but you're not going to lose money. And, sometimes as a business decision, that might be a really good choice. I wouldn't recommend it for your whole business, but some of the advantages where you would use break-even pricing would be things like when you want to gain market share, where you want to enter a newer market area, whether it be with a specific service or a different part of the area where you are. Maybe you're very active in certain suburbs of the city you're at, but you want to get into other suburbs where maybe one of your competitors has more of the business. You can, but with break-even pricing in that area, you can, get more of the business. And it might drive other competitors from the marketplace. So by setting a price that might be difficult for some of your competitors to match, you might have some of them leave the marketplace or be unable to match what you're doing with your pricing. The disadvantages, the number one, obviously, is you're not making any money. The best case scenario on this is that you've done the math right. you're doing enough units of whatever it is you're doing, that service, and that you're, breaking even. And the other danger is you might be setting a market expectation of a price that's too low. People start to want, that price all the time, rather than just being an introductory price. And you see that a lot, out there in the marketplace, with magazines. They're kind of coming to the end of life, if you will, on print copies, to a great extent. But with magazines, you would always see they would give you some great deal for the first year. But then subsequent years, when you would renew, would be at a much higher price. And then you get kind of annoyed, if you're a subscriber, you start to be maybe a little bit upset that, all these new people get this low price, but I got to pay this higher one. So that is one of the risks you take with that on break even. So the second area that we'll talk about are these more market-oriented methods. These ones generally, because they're related to the market, they're going to be a little bit more difficult to set prices on in some cases. So the various options, if you break them down into just a few areas, would be perceived value pricing, going rate pricing, sealed bid pricing, and differentiated pricing. So these ones, rather than being really related to your cost of what you have on costs, whether that be your overall costs or cost of the product or those kinds of things, these are going to be more related to the marketplace. And so this sets a product where the customer's perceived value of what your product is worth sets the price. And a simpler way of saying this is simply put, it's pricing your services at a price that clients are willing to pay for it. And it does allow for, some real advantages when you work this way. With perceived value pricing, things that will influence where you can come up with, your price, how you advertise the service, the promotions that you have, how good are your sales force at talking about the sales and differentiating you in the marketplace and why somebody would choose you, and what kind of after service stuff do you have that you offer that your competitors might not. One of the statistics that I've seen in action that I believe is probably pretty accurate out there is that you can be about 20%, at least up to 20% higher in price than your competitors on a given service if your customer sees something about working with you that they like better than your competitor. Now, not everybody will. Some people are going to be that cost-conscious person, and they're only going to go with the lowest price. But most people, like 85+% of people, will take into consideration whether or not they feel comfortable with the person you sent out that they talked with from the sales area, whether or not they feel like your customer service has been better. Have you been responsive to their phone calls and things like that? Those will absolutely, impact what you can charge for a service. So with perceived value pricing, is a little bit harder showing the math on this, but basically, if you were looking at the cost of providing a service and you've come up and this is the full cost with your labor and overhead and products and all that stuff in, if what that was $250, but you went out there and your market research showed that customers likely will pay $500 for this. And how you would find that out is by sometimes playing around with it and trying it out. So there's some risk involved, but you go out there, you can't usually go out and just ask your customers, hey, would you pay $500 for this? But what you can do is you can put out proposals with some different rates of what you see as the value and how much you're going to add to it, to what your costs are, and see where do you see that drop-off point where clients don't accept the proposals anymore. Wherever that point is, if you back that off a little bit, that's really kind of what your maximum point is of what you can expect that you're going to get from customers. And some of that will depend too on, what you're willing to accept for like a close rate. Some people want a really high close rate. Others, will accept lower close rates, and you'd rather see more people. And especially in this market, at least for us right now, one of the things that we're constantly facing is a limit in the people that can go out and do some of this plant healthcare and tree pruning type work. And so given that that's a limiting market factor, if you can only work and service so many people, you'd rather work with the ones that are willing to pay a little bit more for your services than the people that want just the lowest price. So in this scenario, your potential customer perceived value is about $250. That's how much value is between what your costs are and what they're willing to pay. So your price has got to be between $250 and $500. At $250, you'd be at a break even. At $500, you'd be at an amazing profit margin. So if you price this at $400, your realized customer perceived value on that is about $150, more than what you have. Now, one of the advantages of this versus some of those cost-based ones is this generally will lead you to getting a higher amount of profit on your services, because you're not relying on just a fixed number that you're saying, hey, that's our number that we're willing and happy to get, a 15% or a 20% profit. A lot of companies look at 20% as a good number for profit. It seems reasonable. This allows for you sometimes to get almost unreasonable profits. And, that's not a bad thing, particularly on certain services. Like I said, that there might be more demand for, and that the market might not have as much people to provide them. Again, the advantages on perceived value pricing, it maximizes, like I said, your potential profit. It allows you to create value. So you get to be the one who helps educate and show your customers why they would spend more, because they're going to get bids from other people. And you want them to see that you're offering something better for the same price. In fact, one of the things that will work to your advantage is, in general, when you look at something and you have products where one is more expensive than the other, one of the first things that people will just naturally assume, many people will question it, but in general, you'll believe that there must be something better about that product. There's a reason why they're charging more. And it's not true. It might be true, but it's not necessarily true. Sometimes, somebody just has more costs, and so they're listing a higher price, but it does give you that chance to create that value. And it allows you to differentiate yourself in the marketplace. Some of you, I'm sure on this call, that you've got people in your marketplace that are kind of that low end, low price, company. You don't want to be that company. In fact, it's part of what you're trying not to be. You want to be that premium company, or the company that does the work really well, and that, people can count on you. That's not necessarily, or that the level of service that you do for people is higher. So you're not trying to be super cheap. Now, the biggest disadvantage with perceived value pricing is it requires a lot of market research and potentially some lost jobs with setting a price point that is too high. That's going to happen. And that's where you've got to figure out, where is that point where your sales drop off, or at least a closing percentage of your sales drop off, where if you go that any higher, you're going to get to an unacceptable, close rate. And as I mentioned earlier a little bit, you're going to get rid of probably the price conscious buyers, and it depends again on what the service is. We absolutely use within Rainbow a lot of these different models, depending on what the service is, where we are in the marketplace, and what we're trying to do with that service. Are we trying to grow it? Are we trying to make a better profit with it? All those things, come into play. Going rate pricing, it can be broken up into a few other sub areas. And as it says, going rate pricing is about what people in your market are charging. So one of them is the competitor's parity method. You look to see what another company in your market is charging. In fact, most likely you want to look at what your major competitors are. Who are you, competing against on your bids? And you want your prices to be comparable to them. And then hopefully, as I mentioned, you take into account some of the other things, and you put together a better presentation or other things that would have them choose you at the same price because they feel better working with you. Premium pricing is one where you expect to, in fact, you maybe even, let your clients know that we might be a little bit higher than some of the other companies out there, but here's why. And you educate them and you show them and you let them experience that you're going to do a better job than your major competitors. And that's why your bid's going to be a little bit more expensive maybe. Or discount pricing. You might want to charge a little bit lower than what some of your major competitors are offering. And you might, let them know that, hey, here's how we're able to offer a bit lower price. You might have less features. You might just mention, hey, we're a smaller company. We don't have all the overhead costs that these big companies have. And that might be what you use as part of your pricing conversation with customers. But any of these, are viable ways to look at and adjust slightly on kind of the going rate out in your marketplace. And really, again, the only way to know this is to, check in, get bids. We occasionally do what we call mystery shopping, where you have some of the employees of the company or your spouse or somebody gets a bid from a few competitors. We also have very often, we have clients that get a bid from us and they're more than happy to share what they got from the competitor, especially if the competitor was offering a lower price. They want to show you that so that they'll see if you're willing to match it or do better. We may or may not, depending on what the service is, but you do get a very good picture then of what your competitors are offering for their price. With going rate pricing, the benchmark for setting prices is that price set by your major competitors. So one of the problems you can run into sometimes is that major competitor changes its price. The smaller firms might be almost forced to change their prices, regardless of whether or not they've got higher costs or lower costs, or their demand isn't quite as high. But one of the things that this does do is it helps, keep away from price wars where the price just keeps getting driven down in the marketplace. And when you're within sort of a certain range of what your competitors are doing, and their people are getting bids, you're going to be somewhere close, hopefully, to what theirs are. And clients then see that out there. And again, it comes back to what the client can justify, that you're a little bit more. Oh, why is that? Or you're about the same. Well, then they're going to look at other factors, on choosing you, or you're a little bit less. What might they be giving up? But in all these scenarios, it says that the market is kind of stable and there's not anything crazy. All of you on this call, I'm sure, have been out to jobs where you had somebody that looked at a bid you gave them, and your bid was, $5,000 for taking out a giant tree, with all the stuff it was going to take and the equipment, and somebody else comes in with a bid for like $900. That's where it becomes not a going rate pricing. And oftentimes that's somebody that just doesn't know what they're doing. They don't value their service. And that's what you end up having to tell your client. But oftentimes, some of those bids will be, reasonably close to one another. And that shows the client that, there's a reasonable price that you're putting in front of them. So, to sum it up, the advantages on going rate pricing: it avoids price wars, reflects the wisdom of the crowd, so to speak, in setting market price. The disadvantages: you can become kind of a follower rather than a leader in the marketplace. So you're kind of setting your prices based on what your competitors did, rather than, really owning what your price is and then being able to justify that and earn that difference in price with your customers. And the other disadvantage is, your costs just might be higher than your competitors. So if you have to match the going market rate, and you've got nothing else to differentiate yourself, you know, you're going to make either less profit or potentially lose money than your competitor will in that market. Just a couple more of these, and then we'll move on to probably the more exciting part of the conversation here. Sealed bid pricing, I put in because a lot of you end up doing these. You put a price in, you get a request for proposal or a contract request from various cities, government agencies typically. And you've got to submit your price, you know, and typically the lowest bid at which you're willing to do the requested work might be for, you know, how much per hour or how much, you know, you would charge for trees in a certain range or size, or how much cost per diameter inch, whatever the case might be. You submit those in sealed bids. Some of those will actually take into account other factors, not just the lowest price, but they'll take in and award points for having certified arborists on staff. For some of the ones in town we have here, they look at, you know, your safety programs, and you have to, they become kind of complex. So they're not always looking for just the cheapest person. They're looking for who they feel is going to do the best job for their community or association or whatever the case might be. But they're, you know, it's pretty straightforward, but it's, you know, you're putting out your best price and there's no real negotiation typically after the point. The last one that we'll talk about is differentiated pricing. And this one is where you would charge different prices for the same service. So, and here's some of the examples of that: customer segment pricing, timing pricing, or area location pricing. So the first one, customer segment pricing, you're going to charge that same price depending, but you might have different prices for customers if they order a lot of something. So you might have volume discounts. At Rainbow, we use that a lot on our plant healthcare. You know, there's a certain amount of cost for just showing up to a property. The more of that product that we can deliver on one site visit to that one customer, the lower we're able to charge for that. And I'll show that a little bit later in the presentation here. Sometimes payment terms. Many of you might offer something like 5% off if somebody pays in full when they sign their contract for the year for the work that's going to be done, and so forth. But basically, you know, you're offering a different price because there's something that's being either given up or something that's being done at a higher volume than other jobs. So there's a justifiable reason. The second one is timing pricing. Here you would charge different prices for the same exact product or service because of when it needs to be done. And you might charge a lower price during a low demand time. You know, at Rainbow, we have a higher price that we charge for pruning when there's a storm event because we end up bringing in crews and we have to pay overtime. Oftentimes this stuff happens on the weekends or into the evenings. And it's a very understandable one, you know, when you've got to get stuff done faster than what it would have been if they would have waited, but the client can't wait. So you're able to charge a little bit different because of the speed with which you're going to deliver the service. And the final one is area and location pricing. And this we kind of talked about a little bit earlier. And that is that you might charge a different price in different market areas. For Rainbow, this comes up a lot with some of our plant healthcare services. We've worked with a lot of cities on emerald ash borer pricing, where we have a contract price that the city put out for bid. We won that contract, and then we offer the residents of a certain city a fixed cost per diameter inch for treating their trees. And that price might be a little bit different in the adjacent suburb. They're usually fairly close for us, but it all depends on, you know, what we had to price and what the city's volume was, and partly whether or not we want to be working in that city. Is that an area that we want to have a lot of trees? There's a few, you know, municipal areas where they weren't very desirable to us, and so we didn't offer as good of a price. Some of those we got, some of them we didn't, but we did take those things into account based on, you know, the area where it was. The advantages with differentiated prices, you can adjust pricing in a way customer can understand. Like I mentioned with storm pricing, if you're booked up with a long period of time in lead, you're going to want to, and you've got to bump jobs, which might cancel on you. You need to be able to justify that increased cost to customers, and people understand. You're bumping the line. You're getting weekend or night service, emergency service. You can pay more. And again, it allows you to really maybe decide to move into a market area where you haven't had as good of a presence. In another area, you're established. You've got clients, they expect a certain price, and they've been willing to pay it. So you don't discount there. But in a new area, you might offer it just to gain that market share. So the disadvantages of this are customers talk to each other about prices, and they post prices on Yelp and Facebook and places like that. So it is important that when we're talking with clients, we let them know how we come up with prices for stuff, because we get clients all the time who will call in and ask, well, why am I paying more for my ash tree than my neighbor is paying? And we can look at the two properties and say, well, your ash tree is 30 inches and your neighbor's ash tree is 20 inches in diameter. And this treatment is based on, and the dosages for it are based on that diameter size. So this is why you're paying this much more. And they're like, oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense. But in other areas, that conversation would be much harder because they don't want to pay more. They're frustrated that their city didn't end up asking to negotiate for a discounted price for all their residents, but that the neighbor who lives literally across the street, but they're in a different city, gets that price. And the other one that really comes to place, it can be a little bit confusing to your sales force. As I mentioned, we have over 30 cities that we do Emerald Ash Borer pricing in. And I think we have in the neighborhood of 21 different price points that we have to have entered in our system. So you need actually a chart that you can look at to keep it straight. Depending on what zip code you're in, it tells them which price the client is eligible for because of the different contracts and so forth. So it can, it literally is confusing for your own salespeople sometimes when you're doing different pricing. All right. So at this point, a lot of you are probably wondering, what should I be charging for my stuff? I came in because I wanted to figure out how much to charge for my service. Well, unfortunately, at the end of this, I can't answer that for you, but I can give you over these next 10 to 12 slides, I'll give you the stuff that you should be taking into account to come up with that. So what things affect how you price at the company level? Well, the cost of the products that you have, your direct labor costs, your overhead costs, how much profit you want to make, the perceived value in your marketplace, the market competition, the going rate, what kind of volume somebody's going to do at any given property, the payment terms maybe, timing of delivery, and the area or location of delivery. So basically, all those things we were just talking about, those are the things that you kind of need to be taken into account, or at least deciding which one is most important for the service that you want to put a price on. Now, as it relates to your salespeople, if you want to sell more plant healthcare service, as I said at the beginning here, you want to make sure that you are enrolling your salespeople and wanting to do it and making it easy for them. So some of the things that your salespeople have no control over are those varying product costs, what the labor costs are, like in your market, what do you have to pay the people that are doing the plant healthcare services? That's driven by the market. Which crew does the job? This comes in all the time for us. Sometimes there's, some of your technicians, they get a lot more done than others will. And so, but on any given day, they might not have any control over which of the different crews does their work. Determining how much profit is expected per job. I'll tell you, with plant healthcare services, it's almost impossible to determine how much profit you're going to make on any given job, or how to look at that as a single line item. And I'll talk about that just a little bit. The weather, some days the crews are out there and the weather conditions are perfect and they get a lot of stuff done. And other days they're supposed to be out there trying to spray trees and the winds are blowing and gusting and they get less stuff done and they have to notify more neighbors. And, that impacts how, those specific jobs came out. But things that are controllable by the salespeople, and I'm going to go through these quickly because I'll cover them on another slide, but the number of hours that you're estimating for something, the rate per hour for equipment that you might charge for, the number of diameter inches, which is a measured item, the square feet, which you can measure, any kind of distance, so length of, say, a trench or a cable, or site conditions, things that you can see that might impact, how you have to charge for your price. And finally, the quantity of almost anything. And I put in here cables as one because it's just the more cables you put in a tree, the more you can take into account, what kind of cost or time might go along with that. So here's kind of a controversial statement warning. So usually when I do these in big conference rooms and talk about this kind of stuff, I'm able to see who's in the audience. But right now, if you're an owner or manager, I'm kind of letting you know that, in my opinion, you're the one responsible for setting the pricing models and how much profit you want to get with these jobs, not each one of your salespeople. It's really all on you to figure out what those prices should be. The salespeople, they're responsible for following the pricing guidelines that you set forth. And if you've done a good job on that first part, then they're able to be a lot freer on making these recommendations. Because what I found over time is if they're trying to calculate out, take a product like Cambistat, for instance, and I'll talk about that again here in a minute. But if you tried to figure out, how many milliliters of ready-to-use solution you need, and it's this size tree, and then you figure out what the cost is on that material, and then you figure out like how much profit you want to make on it, and then you come up with a price for the job. I can tell you what my salespeople used to do when I was one of them. We didn't bid it. It was too much work. It took too much time. So in a minute, I'll show you what we ended up doing that made it really easy to do that kind of work and pricing. So, and that perception of price really comes into play with your salespeople. So confidence in the value equals confidence in price. And if your team isn't confident in what they're pricing, it's going to show to the client. This way, if you set up these models and you have pricing guidelines for all of the services that you have with the stuff detailed, it's going to make a huge difference on whether or not your people are going to make the offer of the service in the first place, but also the confidence on whether or not clients believe like, hey, they know what they're talking about. This price is their price. Because we don't often, in fact, I never want to change the price that I've offered to a client unless I can get some kind of concession or the scope of the job changes. If you're willing to just drop your price because they asked for a better deal, that says that you were overcharging them. It sends a message. And every time you would interact with that client in the future, they're always going to expect to be able to get something less from you or something for less from you. And the other part of this is if the pricing models are really easy and understandable, it really does free up your salespeople to focus on the rest of the sales process, not on how to come up with the price. That should be like the least difficult part of the whole offer, particularly with planned healthcare services. So what makes a great pricing model? Sticking to those things controllable by the salesperson. And again, any other relevant data that they need to price properly, and easy to understand and follow layout with those pricing sheets. So again, I'm just going to run these down because I did bring them up before, but the number of hours, you can look at a pruning job, or you can look at how much time it's going to take, depending on how you price your plant healthcare sprays. You can look at it and determine how long you think in hours, and you can have an amount per hour that you want to get. The rate per hour for equipment, the number of diameter inches. This one's so easy. And the nice part is too, if you had 10 of your different salespeople go out, a customer is going to get the same price. There's a lot of confidence in that. You might be off by a half an inch or an inch or something on how they measured the tree, but it is going to be real constant. Again, the square feet measured, the distances, site conditions, the quantity of almost anything. These are all things that are measurable, either through experience, like the number of hours, or physically with a measuring tape, a measuring wheel, a tape measure, something that they can see and make note of. These are things that if you have your pricing models based on this, will make it fast and easy. Other relevant data that you'll want to maybe put on those pricing sheets are things like site minimums. Like, is there a minimum amount that we can justify coming out to this property? You'll want to have that on there. A per tree minimum. Is there a certain amount, even if you're pricing, say, by the diameter inch, do you want to get at least a certain price per tree, regardless of it, if it's only a few inches? So imagine that you were charging, $10 an inch for a Zytec treatment, for a soil applied, treatment. If you had a 10-inch tree, it'd be $100. But if you have a 2-inch tree or a 3-inch diameter tree, and you wanted to do a bunch of those, do you want to add up all those and then apply $10 an inch, or do you want to get at least like maybe $30 for each tree, so that there's a fixed cost minimum? Dosage rate considerations. Are you going to be making any kind of changes to the amount of product that you're going to use for this treatment? Those units of pricing, the time, the DBH, the square footage, you've got to make sure that those have been recorded in some way so that you can utilize them for the pricing. Chemical restrictions. Some of these products in Minnesota, at least, we have some pretty strict requirements about how much of certain products can be applied per acre. And they define an acre as that specific property that's owned by wherever you're applying it. That's how much area you have to limit with your acreage. And then also certain times product label restrictions, having that on the sales sheet too, so that those aren't missed by your salespeople. One of the things that you can get through scientific advancements, working with them, is using this Cambistat pricing tool. And it allows you to go in and put in, what are you paying for a jug of Cambistat, and what kind of product cost do you want to have as part of your total price? This is kind of one of those ones I talked about earlier with the kind of a markup pricing variation. And then it can populate and fill in all the different fields on your sheet. Went the wrong way. So here's an example of what it looks like for us. I blanked out, obviously, the dollar amounts and the percentages and the minimums. But you can see here, if you were to look and see a tree that's 10 inches in diameter and was in one of these different rate categories for Cambistat, you would be able to look and see exactly how much you should be charging. It has separate columns for the different dosaging categories. And I'll flip on the next slide. I'll show you the back. I've taken off of the label, what it is for all the different trees in our area. And we don't include the ones we don't have. But that way you can look at the back side and you go, oh, I'm looking at a Colorado blue spruce. It's a rate F. I can go to that group F column. I can look at a 10-inch tree and I know exactly how much product and how much price I want to charge for that. The discounting, we look at it and say, up to 49.5 inches, there's no discount. But if they're doing 50 to 74.5 inches, they might get this amount, 75 to 99.5, and so forth, where we've taken into account, an easy way. So the more somebody buys, the better offer they're going to get. And it allows that dosaging to show up for each DBH, so that can get on the work orders too. So depending on what kind of system you use, it makes it even more accurate and easy for your crews to apply the right dosage, because with this product, it's critical that you don't over apply it, or you can get, negative impacts. The back side of that sheet, literally, you probably can't read this real well on your screen, but it just shows, the different categories between A and F, even certain trees that we might not want to treat. Some plants like dogwoods and redbuds, They're so sensitive to growth regulators that you don't want to use it on there. But it lists out all the ones from your local area. It shows those categories and what trees are going to respond well. And even some warnings down in the bottom, like don't treat sugar maple trees if they're going to be tapping them for syrup, because it's a food product. We're just about wrapped up here. I got just a couple slides left. But this is where, when you talk about how to simplify it, this is one of the easiest ways I can visually show you, how the number of jobs or how volume impacts, setting up discounts. If you were to look at, say, an 8-hour day, and you assume or agree that at the beginning of a day and at the end of the day, you've got your mobilization and demobilization. So your crew has to come in, they've got to pick up their products or get all their trucks and then drive to the first job site. Once they're there, they can work. And if you had one job that had the whole day, you're going to be able to be on site, let's call it 83% of the time. And 17% of your time is going to be in travel. So really, if you look at your on-site time for the day, you could be at around $121 and still get $100 net for the day. But as that keeps going up, you've got to be charging more for that hour of on-site time. So if you're looking and you think a job is going to take 6 hours, you're going to have to charge a higher rate than you would at a job where that 6 hours was part of an entire day's worth of work. So for us, we actually are more along this 4-job kind of average. If we looked across the board, about 68 to 70% of our time is on site with some services. This will vary by service too. Others, the travel time is much higher. So with plant healthcare, you tend to be more like that one down below where you're going to lots of jobs in the day and your on-site time and your travel time end up sometimes about equal because the amount of time it takes to spray a crabapple tree or apply a soil applied material is only a matter of minutes, and then you'll spend just as much time driving to the next job. But it illustrates for you how you can look at discounts depending on the amount of volume that you're going to do on any given job, and how you can still end up with the same net returns. This last couple of things here, one of the things, if you know anything about physics, there's something called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And basically it says the more precisely you want to know the position of some particle, like an electron around an atom, the less precisely you can predict its momentum at any given point. So if I said, it was in this area right here, your odds of being right are much less than if you said it's just around that atom. Another way of me saying it is the more precisely you try to determine the validity and accuracy of your pricing models, the less likely you're going to be able to validate its accuracy if you're looking at down to like specific jobs. What is very accurate, however, is when you look at all the jobs that you did. So if you look at all the trees that you sprayed crab apples for, and you took all the time it took to do those and divided that by your costs, you'll get a real clear picture of what it costs on average per tree. And that's really where you want to be looking at, when you validate your results to see if your pricing models were accurate. So, what units you can look at for evaluating that is how many inches are you getting done in an hour? And comparing different application methods. One thing we found is with Cambistat, if you have to kind of pull back the soil and create a moat and then mix it up and pour it around the tree, it's just as effective as if you use that HTI 2000, but you can do it in a fraction of the time. And when you look at your returns, it more than pays for itself in how quickly you can get the jobs done and dosed very, very accurately. How many square feet did you get done in an hour for that service, or how much revenue per hour? And you probably want to be differentiating, like I said, the difference between your total revenue, punch in to punch out per hour, from the on-site time revenue per hour, which is really what allows you to figure out where you can put for discounts on any service. Here's a real world example for us with Mectonite. We treated 450,000 inches and we used 543 hours. So basically, we treated about 80 inches an hour. When we were using a different emamectin formulation previous to that, we treated 273,000 inches over the course of the year. We used 4,940 hours, and the number of inches per hour was 55 inches in an hour with, we're talking 25 to 45 techs out doing this for the course of a summer. That's, we got 45% more done using just a different product. So that's why I say it's important to look at the product and the equipment and the delivery methods, not just, the service itself. And then finally, like I said, use your actual data to test. Once you've gone out, you've created kind of a model, you put out prices, it's critical that you measure those things I was just talking about and see how close you are. And then that allows you to make those adjustments to your model to get that profit and the outcome that you wanted. So, and if you use Excel spreadsheets, that's another way that you can take all the jobs that you did and the number of inches you did, and you can create a model of what if I charged this instead? What would my resulting income been on that? And that will tell you again how much you would need to adjust your products to get the right price. And that really kind of concludes what I had to present today. Sorry I went just a few minutes over, so we'll do the question and answer stuff, and I'll be able to stick around for a few more minutes for that. But we'd love to hear any questions people have.
Perfect. Thanks, Tom. Real quick before we get to the Q&A, just want to remind you all of more upcoming webinars with our Grow Your Plant and Healthcare business coming up. Next week, we have Developing and Training Your Consulting Arborist, which we'll have Tom back for. And there will be a short survey when you log out of the webinar, and we appreciate if you fill that out. That helps us kind of figure out which way to go for future ones. And with that, we will open it up to Q&A. Please remember to type them into the Q&A box at the bottom, and we will get started. All right, so first question. Is there an easy, honest way to find out competitors' pricing?
Well, sure. Well, that's a little bit of a loaded question. So I'm assuming the honest way, one of the ways we do it, there's really two ways. One is we use a mystery shopper, where you have, family members or employees, that work in your office that your competitors don't know, and you have them go to your parents' house or places like that, and they ask for a bid for work that they want to have done. Now, by honest, I mean, it's if you'd think that that's not something that you feel is ethical, but it happens all the time. It's really an accepted business practice. All kinds of industries do it, not just in the tree industry. Then the other alternative you have is to solicit your customers, people that you've given bids to. Even your customers that work with you a lot, some of them will tell you periodically like, hey, I just wanted to make sure we were, I wanted to double check and see what other people were charging for what you're doing. And they'll share the bid and they'll tell you what it was. And they'll be like, yeah, it was about the same price, but you guys do such a good job, I'm sticking with you. Or they'll get a bid and it's ridiculously low. And they'll show it to you. And it's an opportunity then to see, what the competitor's charging, and also, an opportunity to have a conversation with them on what we're doing that maybe they're not doing. So that's probably one of the bigger ways. And I have all my salespeople forward me anytime they get an opportunity to get the bid, or when clients say, no, I'm going with somebody else, they had a lower price. They'll literally ask for the client, and a lot of people are happy to share it with you. They'll ask them to just, hey, would you mind just forwarding that over to me? We are always, looking to make sure that we're in the market where we need to be. And that way we have that information as a resource.
All right, next question. Do you price fertilization off of DBH?
We do not do it strictly off of, well, that's not 100% true. Most of it we do based on the actual square footage. So we use a measuring wheel and we measure the area for the tree. Each tree that we want to fertilize, particularly on residential sites. On commercial sites, oftentimes you might be doing 60 spruce trees or something, 60 trees that are all about the same size, planted at the same time. And you'll measure a few of those and take that average and then apply that times the number of trees there are to do. We do sometimes do it. And I'll tell you that our research has shown from checking on literally, hundreds of thousands of trees, on average, 25 square feet per diameter inch is a reasonable number to use for that if you wanted to do it that way. It is a quick, easy way to do. And it's a way that you can then, your crews can be instructed. If it's a 10-inch tree, they treat it for 250 square feet. And it is a way to do it without having to go out and measure that for all the properties or the people that you have that you might know what their trees are, but you have the DBH on. You can do that. The danger with doing it is that oftentimes some of those trees, it'll actually be less square footage, especially on commercial sites because of the limited root zones sometimes with sidewalks and parking areas. And, so you might have a 10-inch tree that's in an island, its square footage is never going to change. It's always going to be that square footage of inside the island. Always best to get a real measurement, but in a pinch, we'll look at that cost per, 25 square feet per diameter inch.
Okay, and I can handle the next one. Will this presentation be available online to review again, and how do I get a copy? This was recorded, so it'll be sent out to you via email tomorrow, and it will be on our YouTube channel. You'll be able to find it there. All right, next question. I do realize we're close to going over, if not going over. Feel free to stay if you want to get the answers to your questions. We'll go through as many as we can here. Next one is, what do your actual proposals look like? How much product information and product benefits to the client's trees do you include in the actual proposal?
Sure. So there's a couple of parts in that one. What do our proposals look like? I wasn't really prepared to pull one up right at the moment, but basically it shows, for us, it lists the tree that's being treated, a service description, like, applying maintenance fertilizer with, this many macronutrients and micronutrients, plus biochar, lasts for about 2 years. So it describes that, which tree or trees it's being applied to, and then a cost. So if, we were spraying crab apples, it would say, doing, preventive spray for crab apple, apple scab, putting, 22 trees and then a total price for that. Generally, we don't put the name of the product on there, except that we do generally put it on there for our own branded products because we're marketing ourselves always. So, we will put on there the name of the product that's being utilized when it favors us. Was there any more to that question?
Nope, I think you got most of it, or I
Okay.
think you got all of it. Next one might be a little similar. What are the most common pricing structures in use by tree care service companies? Which one tends to be the most beneficial for a seasonal business like a tree service?
Yeah, so again, I'll tell you that if you can take your early on, if you're first getting into it, that markup pricing is probably the easiest one to develop, where you take a fixed percentage and of whatever your product costs are, and you use that to determine your, say 20%, and you then apply against the cost of the product to come up with a cost per inch or amount per 100 square feet or 1,000 square feet for fertilizing. As you get more nuanced in it, you'll start then evaluating those results, and the percentage becomes less important as comparing it to what your real costs were. So in that case, you'll start looking at the more the cost plus type pricing. And then of course, none of these. So it's always a little bit, if you look at any of those ones I presented, it's rarely just one of those. It's a combination of markup pricing and going, that you look at, then you compare it against what your competitors might be charging. And then also, you take into account where is it, how much, what time do they need it done? All kinds of different things, the value that you might be providing. I'm guessing a lot of people on this call consider yourselves and your companies a little more premium than maybe some of your competitors. And then you'll take into account those items. So that 20% might not be enough. It will evolve as you evaluate these. But at the end of the day, you always want to make sure that whatever you use to come up with it, that you evaluate what your real costs were and how much time did it really take to treat those things, because that will then tell you what you should be charging, just to break even. And that allows you the flexibility then to add on a certain profit or whatever you want to do as you get more used to delivering that service.
All right. Next one, would you advise using ArborGold PHC software to optimize keeping track of cost, pricing, inventory, etc.?
Yeah, it is possible. So we are partnering up with ArborGold more now. We just went into their software this last November. We're using the plant inventory portion of it. And we're actually working with them. We just have a big update that's coming on how it loads the maps, which has been a bottleneck. Within the next couple of weeks, that should be dramatically different. We haven't really utilized as much the, what do you call it? The job, pricing, profit, that piece, because we've kind of taken a lot of that into account ourselves. So what we are using is their sliding scales. So we've calculated out, to get the profits that we want. We've calculated, how much should we be charging for a diameter inch for any kinds of service that we're doing, or how much for and they use a canopy area for square footage. What should you be charging for fertilizing? And the nice part is that automates the pricing too, so you don't have to look at your chart to look it up. If you've collected the tree and it's a 10-inch tree and you're charging 10 inches diameter, when you pick the service, it fills in $100 right off the bat. So.
All right, next one. Do you estimate spray jobs by square canopy?
Yeah, actually, we do it. I came up with this years ago. We look at the diameter size of the trees. So and then we look at a couple of different factors. One is the first tree. So we charge more, like what our trip charge is worked into the cost to spray the first tree. And then all the additional trees are at a much lower rate per tree, because what you're then accounting for is just the time on site and the product. And if you've ever sprayed trees, you know that, spraying a 3-inch tree takes a lot less time and product than spraying a 30-inch tree, which we don't really spray much of, in fact, anymore. It's just not acceptable, and equipment is hard to do. But you can look at, very easily then and say, oh, they've got 5, 6-inch trees. I need to charge this amount on the first tree, and then 4 times this amount for these smaller trees, and that gives me my price for it. So, that's how we've done it, is based more on diameter inches. And then we also have a couple different price codes. So it depends on the product mix costs. Some things like spraying apple scab are super cheap, to mix up 100 gallons of solution, versus if you've used ever Celiprin for Japanese beetle treatment, that is very expensive. Stuff costs like $2,000 a gallon, or something crazy like that. I don't remember in front of me here, but when you mix it up, it's not nearly that bad, but it's a lot more expensive than it is for crabapple sprays. And so we take that into account, and it impacts, what charge you have for each individual tree based on diameter size.
All right, next one. Do you know of any pricing Excel templates that work well for arborist companies?
Well, I do know that they've taken a lot of the sheets that I've developed, like that Cambistat one I showed you. I know that if you work with your rep from Scientific Advancements, they've converted many of those into ones where you can use that as a template with by popping in a few different numbers from your costs and your stuff to come up with a starting point at least. And it's a great way to present it again for your salespeople. That's easy for them to follow and put onto the proposals then.
Yeah, and especially I think most of our branded products have ones attached to them now. But yeah,
Yep.
available through your territory manager.
Yep, they're a great starting point to look at, kind of a layout, what it'll generate. It gives you a pretty close idea of how we laid it out. And I will tell you too, I always make this challenge. I've never found a service that I can't create a pricing sheet for that can be followed. So if you think you got a service, I'm up for the challenge to hear one that we can't use a pretty good guideline for, that will base it off of measurements and hours or whatever. Anyway,
Next one, how much do you expect your techs to bring in per day?
Again, it really depends on the service. A lot of our plant healthcare services, are, and this is where it comes into play. Things like apple scab sprays, that's a commodity spray for us. That's one where a lot of people in town, if you spray anything in the Twin Cities, you spray apple scab. So on that one, it's a lower price per hour than we would on other sprays that we do that most of our competitors don't even know what the insect or disease is. And so we would expect a higher cost per hour. Most of our plant healthcare services, range anywhere from $200 to $300 an hour. From punch in to punch out is what they'll end up producing.
All right, 2 more questions. Appreciate everyone who stuck around. Next one is for repeat sprays like apple scab. Do you typically ask for payment for the whole year or bill after each service application?
We've typically done just we bill after each service application. We have offered to some clients, and we've looked at it as offering, a discount if they pay for their plant healthcare stuff all up front for the year. And some of them like taking advantage of that, especially if they've got a lot of different PHC things. We end up out there sometimes, in 1 month, we might be out there 5-6 times, and they're just more annoyed at having to pay a bill every time. So they'd rather just pay it and be done. And we've got a little bit of a discount when they pay cash up front or credit card up front, because we don't have to, bill them every time either. And we for sure got paid. So that's kind of more a business decision for each company. But I will tell you, it's always better to get paid ahead if you can.
All right, and last question. Since PHC is typically a repeating annual service, how do you adjust prices up each year or a few years?
Yeah, so one of the things we look at is, again, all the things that I talked about in here, I look at. So something like emerald ash borer, some of those we have contracts on, so we don't change the price on. Other stuff we're looking at, but we're also looking at that as it's a limited market time. So these areas that we're going after, we haven't yet actually increased our prices over the last few years. We're trying to gain as many trees under protection as we possibly can, knowing that if we don't get it now, it'll never be available. On other services, we look at, how many did we do? We evaluate, I'll look at like chlorosis injections where we're using verdure, and we'll look at how many hours did the crews spend going out and doing how many inches of those treatments for what the price was. And we'll look at it and we'll see how does that profit percentage compare to what we would like to have. And if it's not enough, we'll make whatever adjustment we need to do to get to where we want it to be. Because that's also a service that we're not really competing against many people on. In fact, Cambistat treatments for us, that's our highest one. We get can't remember, it's over $400 an hour on those services. They're really profitable because the market allows for it. We're differentiated in that we're offering a service that most of our competitors aren't. And so it really will depend on what the service is. With pruning right now, even though this is really geared towards PHC, with pruning, we just marked up 15% right now. We're so booked up with pruning work right now, we would rather, lose some jobs and know that whatever capacity we have available or that's very limited, we'd rather just make a better return on that work than take every low job and try to get all the jobs we might have in the past wanted. But that could change. if all of a sudden the market drops out, we might have to lower pricing, on our per hour basis to make sure that we're keeping our crews busy. So, but right now that just hasn't been an issue. We're booked up 10, 12 weeks. I would love to be at a more reasonable time frame.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Tom, for the presentation and joining us today. And thank you everyone for joining. Don't forget there is a short survey at the end that we'd like you to fill out, and the recording will be sent out tomorrow through email and can be found on our YouTube channel. Thank you everybody and have a great rest of your day.
Great, thanks.